I was invited here to speak about Alberta's groundwater, and before I get started on that, maybe I'll just give you a little brief history of myself. I've been in this field of practice for about 30 years in the natural resources, particularly around earth sciences. My background started in geology, petroleum geology, with my degree from the University of Saskatchewan in '85, and then I went on and had an epiphany in 1990 and decided to switch from oil into groundwater. That was my interest area, and went on and completed a master's in hydrogeology at the University of Calgary in 1993. And was working in the field for a while, and then eventually got inspired to do a doctorate on my work that I was doing in Cold Lake, looking at the effects of in situ in situ development, thermal in situ development, and the implications on groundwater quality from the heating of the earth and things like that, which we basically stumbled across arsenic as one of the issues around that particular activity. Since then, I've been working on my career with this company. I started with a company called Comex International back in the day, which was eventually purchased by a big company out of Australia called Worley Parsons. And worked with them until about 4 years ago when I joined a smaller upstart company that we started called Integrated Sustainability, and now we've actually opened up a new service line called InSolutions, which is more around the strategic planning advisory services role. So my background is in geology, hydrogeology, and geochemistry in the subsurface, but as we know, all of the water in the hydrologic cycle is connected at some point, so we have to treat it very, very holistically. So today I'm going to be talking about Alberta's groundwater in particular, and how it might interact with surface water, looking at how it's used, some of the risks, and some of the management solutions. So groundwater does represent a significant resource in our province. It goes without saying, there is a lot of groundwater. I'll show you what some of the work that we've done with Alberta Innovates to kind of do an inventory on that. But industry does depend on it, and so do people. About 23% of Albertans rely on groundwater for their day-to-day needs. That's a lot of people. And they're not spread equally across the landscape. They are concentrated in certain areas, which does lead to some challenges around groundwater management. We're projecting continued growth of GDP. We are in a negative growth right now, but that, as you know, that's not going to last forever. I mean, this is a cyclic nature in this business. There's no way we're going to stop burning hydrocarbons in our lifetime anyway, so that development is going to continue. We're projecting 2 to 4% per year going forward. That's the current projections right now. The population itself is projected to reach 6 to 7 million people, depending on what you're looking at the statistics, which then equates to 1.4 to 1.6 million groundwater users in the province. So we're seeing steady, constant, maybe 2 to 3% growth in groundwater use. And when you pull all that together, like the fact that the economy is tied to water, and the groundwater is part of that, and that we've got a growing population, the knowledge around the potential impacts to groundwater aren't really that well known right now, which leads into a project that I've been involved with Alberta Innovates Energy Environment Solutions over the last 3 years, looking at predicting Alberta's water future. So this is a very holistic look at Alberta's water, taking into consideration climate change, climate variability, population growth, food production, energy extraction, and the such. Right, so we're now starting to see, and it's a pleasant thing to see in our sciences right now, a melding of philosophies into a more holistic way, an approach to resource management. On this slide, we're doing comparisons between groundwater and surface water. Most of the water in the province is accessed from rivers, as we know. It's because it's easy to access water from those. But it ends up being, the thinner end of the wedge, as I'll show you a little bit later. About 10 billion cubic meters, or 10 cubic kilometers, if you want to use those units, is allocated in this province. That doesn't mean it's used, it's allocated, but it could be used. And so you can see the lion's share of that, on average, in the province is used for agricultural development, as well as commercial development. About 10% of that, all the water that's used in Alberta is used to support oil and gas operations, with most of it, about 8%, in the oil sands. And that, of course, that water is coming from the Athabasca River. If you look at groundwater in comparison, about 0.4 billion cubic meters per year is allocated. Most of it for oil and gas development. So a lot of the in situ operators up in the Athabasca Cold Lake area use groundwater, whether it be non-saline or more predominantly saline water now, to make the steam for their operations. And agriculture, to some degree, uses groundwater for irrigation purposes. But obviously, oil and gas is more heavily weighted towards groundwater than all the other sectors. So how much is there? This is the big $1 million question. So I was involved in a study started in 2010 with Alberta Innovates, or it's actually at that time it was the Alberta Water Research Institute, to look at the dynamics of Alberta's water supplies. So again, this was a very holistic look, looking at surface water, groundwater, all of that, and trying to understand how much water do we have, where is it, how is it being used, how is it changing over time, that type of thing. So I was responsible for the groundwater component, given my background. So we started looking at, okay, well, what type of aquifers do we have in our province? And there's different types. So I'm going to lay them out here for you. The first ones are these near-surface sands and gravels. These are glacially deposited sands and gravels, or recent alluvium from river deposition. And you can see that throughout the province, there's quite a bit. Here's the Red Deer River Basin, so there's quite a bit of gravel, particularly in the southern part of the province. This is near surface, within the top 30 feet, 10 meters. But they are, considered to be aquifers. Anything that can hold water and deliver water at a sufficient rate is considered an aquifer. So how much is there? We did basically the back of the envelope calculations, looking at volumes and porosity and things like that. How much water field space, and a median volume. So median, I'm using the median, which is kind of the average, but it's a non-parametric statistic. Because this is fairly skewed. It's got a wide range on it, but we're looking at about 35 cubic kilometers of water held in those near-surface sands and gravels. Just to put things into perspective, the flow of water in the rivers in Alberta is about 130 cubic kilometers every year. Most of it in the north, in the Peace and the Athabasca, about 18 cubic kilometers in the North Saskatchewan and South Saskatchewan, going off into our neighboring province. So most of the water's in the north, less in the south. Most of the people in the south, less in the north. So we've got a big disparity about where the water is and where the people are. And we're not the only country that faces that. If we look at the next type of aquifers we have buried channels. So this is effectively the paleo drainage network of the province prior to the last continental glaciation. So much like the Peace River and the Athabasca, there was a drainage system of ancient rivers that drained off to the north and to the east. And some of these features are fairly significant in size. So we can see that here's one particular one that I like to highlight. It's up just north of Cold Lake. It's called the Weow Channel. It's 20 kilometers wide and about 300 meters deep, and it contains granular deposits. Not consistently, but lots of granular deposits. So it's a very, very large system. Some of these can be, that large or of similar size, and they do trend off into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So they extend across from the mountains right across to the Shield, basically. So they're very prolific systems, and people do access them for their water supplies. The volume of water within those buried channels is obviously higher. They're a lot larger in nature, a lot thicker than some of these near-surface sands and gravels. So you're looking at about 135 cubic kilometers of water. Water is constantly moving through these systems at various rates. In unconsolidated deposits like this, you're looking at flow rates on the order of tens of meters to maybe 100 or 200 meters maximum per year. That's how quickly that water is flowing through. So it's not swooshing through the system, but it is constantly moving. And it depends on the gradient. So I think it was pointed out, if you start pumping, you change the gradients and you can actually increase the movement towards the point of low pressure, basically. So, but if you look at the age of the groundwater in this province, It ranges anywhere from maybe 1,000 to 2,000 years to millions of years. I've looked at some of the ages in the Pascapoo Formation, which is our prolific bedrock formation here in the province. You could be down 100 meters and it's million-year-old water. So it's not shooting through the system, and it really depends on where you are. So understanding how recharge manifests itself and how water moves through the system and how much we're taking out is the move towards trying to understand a sustainable development of that resource. So we're on the path. Fracking? Yeah. Yep, we've been looking at that particular challenge. I'm going to get to it a little bit later. It's obviously one that people are quite concerned about. Being involved in this business and working with the regulators to try to bring a little bit of context to this, I think is quite important. I think there's a lot of fear out there about it, and there's reason for that. I think we've seen things that have happened down in the United States. But we have to be careful when we look at what's happening in another part of the world and then try to project it back here, because not all jurisdictions are equal in how they regulate things. In Alberta, we're pretty lucky. We have some of the strongest environmental regulation in the world in Alberta around water, and under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act and the Water Act. And we have a regulator, now that is quite focused on, ensuring prudent and safe development of these resources. That's not to say you don't run into issues, and we need to understand why those are happening. But there are quite stringent rules around how wells are to be installed and cemented and tested and monitored and that. So, I'm a little bit more. I'm a little less fearful about it. Although I'm still. We can't take our attention off of it, or we run the risk of having some longer-term issues down the road. So there's a network of wells throughout the province called the Groundwater Observation Well Network that is operated by Alberta Environment. That was in the hands of Emera, but now that's obviously back into the fold. There's about 220 of these monitoring wells in various locations, but I mean, Alberta is 660,000 square kilometers in size, right? Now, is 220 wells sufficient to address that? And the legacy around how this monitoring network was cobbled together, so to speak, since the 70s, was very focused on activities, and that's fine. I mean, that's how monitoring, manifests itself over time. Go into the areas where you're most concerned, see if there's anything going on, whether things are drawing down or whether we're seeing, contamination from non-point source, things like fertilizers or pesticides or manure spreading or things like that. The bigger scale problems, the landfills, the smaller scale impacts on the landscape are much lower in magnitude, right? It's the bigger challenges that we face. So yes, there is a network, but one could argue that maybe it's not sufficient. I did do a project with Emera reviewing their GOWN network. It was reviewed at my previous company, Comex, back in the 1990s. And there was another review that was done just about a year ago to look at how sufficient is it? Is it monitoring the right locations? We did risk mapping for the province and identified higher risk areas and identified if there were monitoring wells there. So we identified opportunities to go into areas. I'll show you some of the results of risk mapping for this basin as I get along. But there's a lot of work that's being done, which is great, and it's agencies and bodies like this that are really, really important to bring the message to the regulators about, okay, what is the concern and what do we need to be looking at? And when we had the water conversation a few years ago, hydraulic fracturing was one that came up. So there is attention being given to that, and the regulators are developing more and more directives around protecting potable groundwater resources. The last type of aquifers are bedrock aquifers. These are the most heavily used in the province. We have a large number of different ones. has the lion's share of the groundwater, of the potable, non-saline groundwater in the province. There's a whole bunch of them. This is this gray one here is the Pascapoo. The Pascapoo and the Scholard and the Porcupine Hills is the main bedrock aquifer in this province. And there's a reason for it, because that's where most of the people are residing over top of it. So there's about 70,000, 75,000 groundwater wells completed in the Pascapoo Formation. Now we call it an aquifer, but really by international standards, it wouldn't really be considered an aquifer. It is very hit and miss for water. It's quite shaly in places. It's not like some of the world scale aquifers that I've actually had a chance to work on, like the Nubian sandstone or the Great Artesian Basin in Australia. Those are prolific, sandy, sand-rich aquifers. The Pascapoo really isn't, but it does provide water supply for a lot of people in this province through their wells. How is it used? Okay, so we're looking at this basin by basin, showing millions of, now this is millions, so we've now switched from billions to millions, right? So we come down an order of magnitude, showing the millions of cubic meters allocated. And you can see that there's the Athabasca at about 89, the largest amount of water allocated in any of the basins, groundwater that is. And we see that, we range anywhere from very, very low values of, 1.4 in the Milk or 4.1 in the South Saskatchewan, to moderate numbers in the, the 37.3 million cubic meters in the Red Deer here. So you're kind of right in the middle there. What's the estimated use? Typically less than 50%. So remember I said lots of water is allocated, but not all of it is used. This is just the estimates of how much is used in each basin, and you can see that it ranges anywhere from base 20 up to 55, something like that. So a lot of the water that's allocated is not being used. Where is the water being used? Okay, so this is a map that was generated in this new study we're doing, predicting Alberta's water future. Shows the total groundwater usage. This is estimated by township, with the cooler colors being low usage and the warmer colors being high usage, right? So kind of a heat map here. And you can see that the majority is in the Calgary-Edmonton corridor. Here's Red Deer right here, extending out into Cold Lake and up into the Grand Prairie area. That's where most of the people are. That's where most of the groundwater is being used. Makes sense. We have some high use licenses up here in the oil sands. But not a lot of people up there, right? So the pressure on groundwater up there, although we might have a lot coming out in one location, there's not a lot of things that can be influenced other than particularly the river. There's the Red Deer. So you can see that most of the people are kind of in the central western part of the basin. What is it used for by basin? So we see that in the south here, other than the Bow, we see the Old Man is primarily agriculture for groundwater, a little bit in the Milk, South Sask, the Red Deer, a significant, and the North Saskatchewan, a significant amount of groundwater is used to assist with agricultural development. And as you move further north, this is where you start seeing more and more oil and gas use in purple here. So particularly in the Beaver, the Athabasca, the Peace, and the Hay, right? So again, most of the groundwater use for oil and gas development is up in the northern basins. Most of the groundwater use in the south is for agriculture. How much recharges and where does it recharge? So this is a part of this predicting Alberta's water future. We looked at the 2,200 subbasins in the province and we calculated an estimated recharge for each one of those. This table is just showing the overall recharge, which is about 19 cubic kilometers and 19 billion cubic meters a year on average, but you can see that it's not equally distributed across the landscape. So here we've got the dry portion, the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains here down in the south, which typically gets very, very low recharge to almost no recharge in some cases. And if you go up into like the Swan Hills area, you get a lot more recharge potential because there's a lot more precipitation there, so a lot more water can get back into the ground. If we look at the Red Deer, we're about 1.2 cubic kilometers of recharge in the Red Deer River Basin itself. Remember, plants use water. So you can have certain times of the year where, yeah, it might rain, but that water does not make it to the water table because it's utilized by the plants or it's evapotranspired. And it depends on the types of plants. They all have different evapotranspiration rates and things like that. The way we actually did this estimation was we looked at the subsurface soil conditions, primarily the subsurface geology, because the soil is, they could be solonetzik or glacials or whatever. The water moves through those and it has to get down into the water table, and that's typically below the soil zone. So it was the underlying geology or superficial geology, whether it's clay till or lacustrine clays or glacial sands or outwash sands. So we all looked at that and calculated that for every basin using the precipitation. So again, variable, depends on where you are. If you look at the Red Deer River Basin, you can see that, again, most of the recharge occurs up in this part of the basin here, and a lot less down in the southeast drier portions. We also see a variation in groundwater quality. Okay, so this is just using the Pascapoo Aquifer example. You can see that in the upper reaches of the Red Deer River Basin, it tends to be higher quality groundwater. It's not. It's relatively fresh. It's fallen on the landscape. It hasn't had a chance to dissolve minerals and pick up its total dissolved solids. Where you do see the quality changes is a little bit further out to the west. This is pretty consistent across the province. We see the same thing down in the south, where closer to the mountains, you get better quality groundwater. As you move more and more out on the prairies, you tend to get lower quality groundwater. And the same thing with hardness. It's variable. So I guess it isn't groundwater quality does change over space and time. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make here. If you have a water well, you should be testing it, by the way, occasionally, just to see if there's anything changing. Particularly for things like trace elements, like I pointed out earlier, arsenic, which I'm working on. Again, another big provincial study on that, identifying where the clusters are. There is a cluster right around the Red Deer here, by the way, of arsenic in groundwater. So if you do have water wells, you'd have a responsibility to be testing them and making sure that your family is safe. And I'm sure if the Working Well program fellows here, you'll probably give a little bit more on that. Now we know that groundwater is connected to surface water. We were having a conversation earlier out in the foyer, and someone indicated, isn't it interesting that, in the wintertime when the ground is frozen and is covered with snow and there's no water going in, that the rivers are still flowing? Well, that's groundwater. So you can see that you have different styles of interaction with surface water. So here we have a river, and we have a shallow aquifer, and we have groundwater discharging into it. That's a fairly typical scenario in this province. That's what we call a gaining stream or river. The opposite, we have groundwater that is feeding out of the river into the aquifer, and that's a losing stream or river. And the thing is, this can change, even within the period of the flow year, right? We can have certain times of the year where the river stage is high, water is recharging into those nice river gravels, permeable river gravels. The river levels go down later in the season, and the water flows back in. So it can go back and forth. Then we have disconnected streams. This is more typical of places like Arizona, way down in the south where it's really dry. We typically don't have this, maybe up in the mountains, it's quite possible. But we see that we have a stream here that's allowing infiltration to go down and reach the water table and mound it up a little bit. And then we have just disconnected and non-contributing. So these are the types of interactions with rivers. Same thing happens with lakes and wetlands, but I won't get into that. Same type of principle. So this is looking at base flow contribution. So this is a log scale here, so it kind of mutes it out a little bit. But you can see that groundwater is in the purple here. And you can see that it is a significant component of flow in a river at any given time, particularly in the wintertime, because that's when you're not getting any recharge and water is flowing out of the subsurface into the river to sustain it. Also, the base flow has some very important qualities in that it's a fairly constant temperature coming out of the ground, which fish like to spawn in. It can keep these areas warmer in the winter so they don't freeze. So there's a whole bunch of things. It can bring nutrients in, all of these things. So this interaction is very, very important to the aquatic habitat.